early on in this administration, everybody just seemed afraid, right? And those were conversations that I've heard, just recently, is people saying, I've heard like, where is the outdoor industry? Where is, how it was in the first Trump administration when so many brands got together to support bears ears, right? When you would go to the Patagonia homepage and it said the president is trying to steal your land.
I'm Meg Carney, an outdoor and environmental journalist, and this is the Outdoor Minimalist Podcast. Thank you for joining us so that together we can create a better outdoor space as we recreate. By now, we've all likely heard the term greenwashing, but have you ever heard of greenhushing? Well, greenhushing seems to be a growing trend where businesses afraid of backlash or political controversy choose to stay silent about their sustainability efforts or even climate-positive approaches. And while it may seem like a safer, quieter plan in a polarized world, greenhushing can actually hurt your business more than it might help. That's why in episode 185 of the Outdoor Minimalist Podcast, I'm excited to talk to Jason Parkin. Jason is a passionate advocate for using businesses as a force for good, with a focus on sustainability and climate action. He serves on the board of directors for the Outdoor Industry Association and contributes to several sustainability-focused committees, including the Sustainability Working Group of People for Bikes. With over 25 years of experience in creative strategy, user-centered design, and digital media, Jason has led award-winning projects and co-founded Motionbox, a personal video platform later acquired by HP Snapfish. Throughout our conversation, we not only unpack what greenhushing is and what it might look like, but Jason discusses how the current political climate is reshaping the way brands talk about climate, conservation, and corporate responsibility. So if you've ever wondered whether speaking up about your brand's environmental efforts is worth the risk, or how to navigate these conversations without getting caught in a culture war crossfire, this one's for you. So thank you for joining me on the Outdoor Minimalist Podcast today. I'm excited for kind of an adjacent conversation to greenwashing, so I think this will be really interesting. But I think to start, I would like to learn a little bit more about you and your background, if you are someone who enjoys outdoor recreation. If so, how did you get interested in the outdoors in general, and how does it fit into your life now?
Yeah, absolutely. No, and it's a pleasure to be on here, and thanks for having me, Meg. So I absolutely am somebody who, gets a great deal of joy in the outdoors and outdoor recreation. I split my time between New York City and the Mad River Valley in Vermont, and actually just got back from a mountain bike ride a little bit ago, so which is nice to be able to get out and do that, for a lunch break. Um, and my own personal outdoor recreation is really anything and everything involving cycling, as well as hiking, trail running, stints here and there of climbing, snowshoeing, cross country skiing, snowboarding, sort of all the things that you can do and where you can have the time to fit them in. Where it sort of aligns professionally is so my agency Composed is we're a full service creative agency, and so my background is really on the creative side, and so this is something I've been doing for I think about 27 years now. I kind of stopped counting after 20, if I'm being honest. And so Composed will be been around for 15 years come August, and about 8 years ago we were really looking at who we are, what's our stake in the ground as far as who we are as an organization. And so many of those things aligned with our personal values as far as, care and concern for the environment, issues of equity and equality, climate action, et cetera. Around that same time, I went to my first outdoor retailer, which was the first one, I believe, that was in Denver that year, and really just saw that sustainability was becoming more than a trend and really just, where businesses needed to go. So that really aligned with some of the things that we were saying and caring about, and really saw the business potential and opportunity there. And so I've also always seen, and I think it was really demonstrated there, that the outdoor industry is really the tip of the spear when it comes to sustainability, when it comes to purpose-driven businesses, when it comes to businesses looking to take action on climate. And so that was, all those things just sort of lined up. That was also a lot of the reason, that was the motivation for us to not only join the Outdoor Industry Association as a business member, but for me to join as a board member late last year as well too. So all of these things have sort of come together, and I think it certainly wasn't planned, but looking back in hindsight, it certainly makes sense as far as how it all came together.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I've heard it so many times that people view the outdoor industry and like outdoor industry companies as having that like value-based kind of structure, but it doesn't necessarily make them immune to maybe some marketing decisions like greenwashing or green hushing. And we have talked about greenwashing pretty extensively on the podcast. We have several episodes
Hmm.
devoted to that. But a phrase that has come up a time or two in the last year is green hushing. So I was excited to talk to you about that. But for people, before we get into any of it, people might not be familiar with that term. And so, can you give us a quick definition and explain how it might show up in a business?
Sure. So greenwashing, it's really the antithesis of greenwashing, right? So it's doing, and I've also heard it coined go green and go dark, right? So it's doing a lot of really good work and then just not saying a single thing about it. And I understand, it's sort of, it's not quite twofold, maybe threefold, where people are afraid if they talk about the one thing that they're doing, that there's a potential they may get dragged for the thing that they're not doing. There's also, I've heard concerns about just being braggadocious and like, we're doing this because it's the right thing to do, we're not doing it because we want to really try to trumpet it or anything like that. um and then the other is, I think there's a little bit of tendency in the current climate. I've heard more and more in the current political climate here in the U.S. that people are a little bit more reluctant to maybe shout their sustainability values like from the top of the mountain that they may have been inclined to in the past. Um, and so I think while it's all understandable, it is detrimental to a business because I think first and foremost, nobody's doing it perfectly. Nobody has a silver bullet in any of this stuff. If there was, we wouldn't be in this mess. And so I think, a lot of times people forget that it's really about progress over perfection, but it's also at the same time doing that in a way that's very transparent, that's very authentic. To your point about greenwashing, not making claims or, espousing to do things greater than you're actually doing. At the same time, I think there is value. I think there's a lot of brand equity to build. There's a lot of trust with your consumers when you talk about this in the correct manner, that you can really build and foster. And that's over a really, long-term conversation and communication with your audience. It's not just, hey, we checked this box, we did this thing, and we're done, and now we're sustainable. It doesn't work that way, right? This is always evolving, growing. It's setting targets further down the road, making sure that brands and organizations hold themselves accountable to those targets. So it gets pretty complicated, and there's work involved with it. So I think that's also another, potential part of it. Um, the one thing I would say is there was a study late at the end of the year last year that actually looked at the top 100 companies in the US, and they found there was a 58% diminishing return on brands that were green hushing. So one of the things that we like to do is we really always like to look, we understand that we're servicing businesses, we're talking to businesses. We always like to bring it back to the business case for doing this work. And so that's one of the things is that, based on the results of this study is like there's literally money being left on the table. And I think there's so many times, especially when folks are like, oh, we don't want to be the ones to talk about it, we don't want to be the ones to lead with it. Well, if you don't, others in your space probably are. And I think we operate in areas outside of the outdoor space as well too, where you've seen long established brands who maybe they haven't had certain ingredients in their products or anything like that, but because they never wanted to talk about it before, a newer, younger brand comes up and they're like, we don't have A, B, or C in our product line. And all of a sudden, the older, more heritage brand is having to play catch up. They're spending a lot of time, money, and effort to be like, we've never had that stuff, but because they never spoke about it, now a lot of the air in the room has been taken up by one of their competitors. And to that same point, I think, back to the detriments of greenwashing, there's a bunch of time, money, and effort that goes into having to try to fix and reestablish your brand equity once it's been destroyed. And that's something we've seen, that's just across the board. It's not just in greenwashing. There was an outdoor brand that was on the Hill with us lobbying the OIA Capital Summit a couple weeks ago. And, their sort of horror story was they actually tried to move manufacturing back to the US, and it went terribly wrong. And it went terribly wrong in the product quality. And, their product is one that keeps people safe when they're participating in not so safe activities. And it's just so much work to get that back. And that was really sort of their horror story about like, these are one, this was around tariffs. And one of the reasons we tried to manufacture in the US and it didn't work. And, I know that we're not here to talk about tariffs and, onshoring and all those other things. But I think it just sort of paints the picture of, there's just so much damage that you can do to your brand by greenwashing, and it just costs so much time, money, and effort to get back into it. At the same time, if you lose the opportunity to tell your story as a brand that's really doing good work, it's going to be that same time, money, and effort to try to make up for it and try to reclaim the work that you've already done when maybe consumers have already glommed on to another younger, newer brand that's really trumpeting what they've been doing, because that does resonate with consumers. And I would just add one last thing to that is to that same point, there was a recent study that really just shows that a lot of this anti-woke backlash is really just overhyped. It's a very vocal minority. By and large, consumer sentiment around sustainability and making responsible decisions, voting with their wallet, that didn't change with the outcome of the election in the US, right? So a lot of those values are still ingrained in people. It's a lot of decisions that they're still making. So I would just encourage brands to really sort of keep their eye on the ball, keep their eye on the long game for it, not just be so reactive to kind of what's going on in the news cycle at the moment when it comes to things like greenhushing.
Yeah. So there's a lot to unpack there. And I was going to ask about kind of like consumer mindset, or I guess like consumer pressure. Because one example that I will give, you don't have to talk about this brand in any capacity, but I feel comfortable doing that, is the fallout that I saw like on social media and like within the outdoor recreation community around REI's support of Interior Secretary Burgum. And then them coming out later and saying we retract our support and having to essentially like walk back all of this information. But by that time, many longtime members had pulled their membership, etc., boycotted purchasing from REI, returning equipment, all of that stuff. So kind of talking about like the repercussions of one, speaking up about something that you feel as a company you are in support of at the time until you have more information, or two, not saying anything at all. And then consumers are like, why didn't you say something about it? Because you have all of this power and all of this presence. And so I guess my question is like, how do you balance that as a company with the consumer pressure that is going to be present? Because to an extent, you have to appease the consumer for them to continue to purchase from you.
Right, absolutely. And yeah, that was I got questions just personally about that one. And yeah, I think it was not executed very well just across the board. I think is about as diplomatic as you can be with that. And it's I think that goes back to really looking at who you are as a company and what your values are, right? And so really standing by those, not trying to be reactive to placate whoever's in office, whatever, may be trending on the moment on social media. It's really just being honest about who you are as a company, really leaning into what those values are and how they relate to your business. I think is another one. As a brand, I feel like haven't seen it quite as, but like not every brand needs to comment on everything that's going on in the social media space, right? Like nobody wants to hear what X brand thinks about, whatever global happening is happening or otherwise. Um, and it's like if it's not in line with who you are as a company, um, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. And I think, when you look in the space of outdoor brands and areas of impact that they're supporting and things like that, I mean, I think um, some ones that are doing it really well and where um, that really aligns with who they are is I think like All Trails is a great example, right? So in their impact pillars, they really look at land stewardship. They're looking at diversity and making access to trails more equitable, as well as climate impacts as well too, right? All three of those pillars really fall into and support who they are as a business, right? Because if trails aren't maintained, people can get unused what they are. If they want to, we all we should all think, I won't speak for everybody, but we everybody should have equal and equitable access to trails and feel comfortable and safe in the outdoors. And then we all know the impacts of climate change on our ability to recreate in the outdoors, right? So all those things are very important issues, very important on things to tackle, are very much in the lane of who they are as a company. So I think like that really serves as a good example of really speaking to the things that do affect, the work that you're doing. I know some other brands that like, have Greenhush a little bit more, where they're doing fantastic work, where they were on um, part of collaboratives with OIA that were looking at, you know, sourcing renewable energy for their factories in Vietnam, for example, right? And not only is that just good because we need more businesses to participate in climate solutions, but also to the same point, like, you know, as a brand in the outdoors, climate change is literally impacting your bottom line as a business, right? I mean, I think there's, one thing that I keep going back to probably firsthand because, I do spend so much time in Vermont, but 2 years ago, we had so much flooding that literally, we pretty much lost an entire season of mountain biking. Now, when towns are flooding and everything else, obviously mountain biking is not the top priority for anything or anyone, right? But it just does show what those additional impacts are on that outdoor recreation economy. And so while you can say, oh, that's too bad that, folks couldn't mountain bike, at the same time, that does affect local shop owners, other businesses, et cetera. And then, you start to see how that trickles into, you know, people's employment, their livelihood, those sorts of things, and really all the ripple effects that it does have. So if we don't have clean air, clean water, and habitable areas to recreate in, yeah, it hurts us as a business collectively as an outdoor industry, which we don't want. But obviously, there's the more obvious ramifications outside of that. But since we're talking strictly about the outdoor industry, that's where we bring it back to like there's real business impacts and real business implications here. And so for me, I just see it as like being that much more important to get behind and really drive those things.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up. And I mean, any conversation in the outdoor space, or probably any industry at this point, it's hard to escape politics. I feel like historically that maybe wasn't the case, but with the current administration and the volatility of the political environment, the depth at which it's impacting everyone, including the outdoor industry, public lands, climate change, etc. Are you seeing like a more green hushing because they're afraid of those ramifications that could come from the administration, or there's like, how are brands dealing with this, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Yes. So it's sort of twofold. I think early on in this administration, everybody just seemed afraid, right? And those were conversations that I've heard, just recently as people saying, I've heard like, where is the outdoor industry? Where is, how it was in the first Trump administration when so many brands got together to support bears ears, right? When you would go to the Patagonia homepage and it said the president is trying to steal your land. What did gives me hope and makes me feel better is that I think the public lands conversation really helped galvanize people. I'm not sure if you saw, but we were very excited that all sale of public lands was omitted from the reconciliation bill, and so we attribute that to a lot of the lobbying efforts, really as a coalition of a lot of these organizations. So OIA, as I mentioned, we had our lobby day on the Hill a few weeks ago. That was followed by our friends at Protect Our Winters were there the week after that. Conservation Alliance was there the week after that, and there's so many of these groups that got together and really pushed for that, that it just showed that it worked. And when you get enough collective action and groups working together, that we can force the change that we want to see, or I guess in this case, make sure that the change that we don't want to see doesn't happen. So that I feel like has also been a good way to sort of remind folks of that we did get public lands off of this. And I'm hopeful that more people will see this and more organizations will see this as a way to really band together and continue to push against that. I think the other thing that's happening, as it relates directly to the outdoor economy and outdoor recreation, is around tariffs. The outdoor industry as a whole is a $1.2 trillion industry in the US, right? It differs in that it is primarily made up of a lot of small companies, and these tariffs are just destroying so many of them. And I mention that because it sort of returns back to our sustainability conversation, is because when brands are just so shell shocked and just wondering, like, am I even going to be able to stay in business? It definitely puts the brakes on them being able to do anything when it comes to sustainability. So that's been challenging. But back to the earlier question, we have seen brands, like you said, speaking less about sustainability, and that's not even in the outdoor space; it's in other spaces as well. I'd say for the past year, we've seen a lot of massaging and, not saying DEI and saying, inclusivity, those sorts of things. It's just wordplay, it's wordsmithing. The good thing is that at least in any of the brands that we work with, we haven't seen folks stop doing the work. They're just talking about it a little bit differently. Um, which I'm personally not a fan of. I think we were talking about these things before because they are important and they are necessary, and there's things that need to be done. At the same time, especially if you're a publicly traded company, um, I understand what the current situation is that they are having to deal with. And I do think back to that fear piece. I think, you just see how this administration has gone after companies, has gone after universities. I think a lot of folks are afraid that, if they speak up too much, that they're going to be the next ones in the crosshairs. And you've seen that this is an administration that's been very vindictive. It's, really weaponized a lot of the different forms of the government. To what level of success, TBD. It's been good to see organizations or universities like Harvard stand up and push back against it. Um, Maybe I'm rambling on too much about that, but yeah. So I think just back to the original point of it is there's brands that are still speaking up and still doing it, and I think those are a lot of the brands, especially in the outdoor space, that are you've just sort of seen it in their DNA, obviously, like a Patagonia, like a Cotopaxi, like organizations like that. My hope is that the brands that were maybe considering it prior to this, it's not making them just be like, oh, we're just gonna, keep not saying anything. We've been doing fine. Because I will say, just like knowing from working with and knowing a lot of the good people out there, it's like there's just really good work that's being done by people, and there's really smart, really talented people that are leading the charge in so many of these areas. And whether that's renewable energy, whether that's you know issues of creating greater access, whether it's clean chemical management, everything all together. That's some brands that are really doing, and I wish they would talk about it a little bit more. Um, but they have yet to. But I think it would really behoove them to really just lean into that, because it's all very genuine, good work that they're doing, and I think they should be applauded for it.
Yeah, and I mean, it's all connected, right? I mean, all of those things that you mentioned, they all kind of run in the same circle of importance and like are connected to larger goals and impacts. And I do want to touch on renewable energy, but before we get to that, you mentioned about like lobbying with the Outdoor Industry
Mhm.
Association and working with them pretty closely. And so I'm curious, like, what conversations are happening within the outdoor industry about climate responsibility and business resilience right now?
Sure. So it is, I do think we have to be very honest. Tariffs are taking up a lot of the air in the room in the outdoor industry right now. And exactly, why I mentioned before, and this sort of set this up for this as well too, is that so many brands are just wondering, like, are they going to be in business in 90 days? Right. And so it's really hard to still be able to do the work when it comes to climate and those sorts of things. And when we look at that, it's like the bigger brands are going to make it through. They're going to have a hard time. But if you're a brand that's less than $100 million a year, you're getting hammered right now if these tariffs go through. And these are all, by any metric, really successful companies. I mean, there was a great story in the New York Times yesterday about a local company called Bivo, which they make a stainless steel, cycling water bottle. Great company, great product, great people doing it. They just got into REI. They've just been crushing it as far as growth, and all of a sudden with these tariffs now, um, they're wondering if what's going to happen with them, because suddenly with the new tariff impacts, their tariffs are actually higher than the cost of the material or the product that they're bringing in. We heard from other um, companies, and these are like, mid-sized companies, that the price of tariffs for their products was actually higher than their payroll. And so that's just not sustainable as a business. I do feel like, the good thing is that we it very much seemed like we were listened to, we were heard. I think even at the congressional level, people are just white knuckling it, um, on the in the I wouldn't say either side, but on the Republican Party, where everybody's just afraid to step out of line. If, we're being honest. But I think it's also very clear about the economic impacts that this has and how detrimental it's going to be, not just to the outdoor industry, but just the economy in general. I think we already got a glimpse of that. Um, you know, Hopefully this all gets worked out, but until it does, it's just so hard for companies to focus on anything other than, like, are we going to make sure that we can stay in business 90 days from now? Um, that said, there are still a lot of companies out there. There are other companies, outside of the outdoor space, that are doing just really fantastic climate action. We've seen some really good ones in tech. Atlassian is a great. They're a software company. Maybe people don't know the company, but they know some of their products. Um, they've just got a fantastic sustainability team, and I know that because they are on the BPPA project that we did. So just some background there. So we are we're the smallest company in the country that's done a virtual power purchase agreement. And I had the folks over at CEBA, which is the Clean Energy Buyers Association, uh, confirm that for me. So that's exciting from our end. But so what that means for folks that don't know, a virtual power purchase agreement means that you are buying RECs, or so a REC is a renewable energy certificate, and there is one REC generated for every megawatt hour of renewable electricity that's generated. So what a virtual power purchase agreement is, or VPPA, is that we're agreeing to buy those RECs that are generated. And as a result of that, even though we're not directly using them, we're saying, like, if you just generate the electricity, we're going to pay for it. And we're going to, help bring that online. And the difference between that and like sort of, not to get too wonky into this, but I can't help myself with this. So again, so traditional RECs that are created are generally like if there's a wind farm that's up and it's already online and it's just churning out RECs, they just sort of sit there. A lot of times they're referred to as junk RECs. And what happens is companies will come and buy them up for $1 or $2 a megawatt and be like, we wiped out our scope 2 emissions. And when in reality, there really wasn't any impact because that electricity was going to get generated regardless of whether or not that company decided to purchase it. Unfortunately, the vast majority of RECs in the US are purchased this way, and as opposed to the way that we're purchasing them. And I mentioned Atlassian because they're on the same project that we are, albeit at a much larger scale. Um, so these are high impact RECs, and that is a term coined by our partner. It's a great company called Evergreen that's based out of Seattle. And so the difference between the high impact RECs is that these are RECs that aren't generated yet, that we're paying a much higher price point for, about $15 to $20 per REC. And then we're also committing to a minimum 5-year up to 10-year commitment to purchase these RECs. And so what Evergreen is able to do is they can bundle up these different contracts. So it's us, it's groups like Atlassian, Brooks Running is on our project, Stripe, Autodesk. And then so they bundles those up together and they can take them to a developer and say, like, we have guaranteed income for you. And what it does is it takes a lot of the risk off the developer and really helps facilitate bringing the project online. In fact, that's one of the main criteria for them, is that any contracts have to have a material impact on standing up a new project. So with that, that bundled REC brought a wind farm back online in Big Spring, Texas, which is providing clean renewable energy to 19,000 homes, and they sort of have that guarantee already. So the difference between traditional ones versus these high impact ones is that that project wouldn't have come online as opposed to traditional ones. It's just already up. So it really does help facilitate the creation of renewable electricity, which we are still, even with the IRA, I know a lot of that is still in question. We're still not getting to that point, and velocity just matters so much in this. So I do think that there's a lot of great work through our other companies. Like I said, outdoor and not outdoor. I mentioned Brooks being on this with us. REI did a similar project, with the same company with Evergreen that is coming online with a small scale solar farm. So there is that kind of work that's still being done, and that there are industries that maybe aren't being affected as much. So technology, service sectors, that sort of stuff. And for them, it's important. It's also, we don't need to necessarily go down the whole path of the increased electricity demand as a result of AI and data centers and all those other things. But I could get really wonky on that stuff. But yeah, I guess that's just sort of like what we've seen in other areas of people doing stuff. I think when it does come to renewable, I mentioned them before. I think Gore comes to mind as a company that they have a fantastic. I think it's like 200. I forget the exact numbers, but they basically have a huge solar farm that they built that's direct supply to one of their factories in Kentucky. So, and that's just a really huge undertaking that they took. They're continuing to look at ways to provide renewable energy to all of their factories and facility locations. But I think that's a great one. That's just like a great example of like, it's amazing that they made this all happen. And the guy Ryan over there who's heading it is just super smart, has done like a great job with it. But you don't really associate, waterproof outdoor wear and with, renewable electricity and all the good stuff that they're doing behind the scenes as well too. On top of that, with the clean chemistry stuff that they've been doing, they were really a leader and a good partner with so many brands as far as getting PFAS out of any outdoor recreation or any outdoor apparel. So which has been great as well too. Sorry if I
Yeah.
rambled on too much. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the renewable energy thing is interesting because it's something that a lot of brands that I talk to talk about. in
Hmm.
some capacity, because I mean, if you think about it, if wherever they're manufacturing, it takes electricity and power to make these products. And
Hmm.
so like where are all of their sustainability like actions really falling into like their larger goals, and then like which ones are they focusing on to put at the forefront of their messaging. So like because you used Gore as an example, I do remember reading about their like big push for renewable energy, and I thought that was very interesting. Do you ever think that brands will sometimes latch on to one aspect of sustainability in order to avoid conversations about more problematic practices that they may have?
It could be, and I think that's where you start to get into, the greenwashing side of things, right? And I think, I guess is I have to, attribute this to my our friend and a bit of a mentor in sustainability, a guy named Derek Sabori, who is previously the VP of Global Sustainability for Volcom for many years, and it has just been great. His answer to all these things is always it depends, and so I think this can definitely be an it depends situation. If you're talking about there's just really not a way to do this at the moment or the way to do it. And so you're just sort of working with what you have, but still trying to tackle the areas that you can. I think that's understandable. If you're, you know, I don't know that anybody is doing this, but just as an example, if you're like using child labor knowingly and you're like, look at this great renewable project that we're talking about, that's problematic, right? Um, so I think it all just varies. The PFAS thing is a thing where, um, look, it's a great example of how regulation, especially regulation at the state level, can really drive positive change. For those that don't know, the reason why PFAS is is really out of any new outdoor gear that's been made from this year on is because California passed a law saying that there couldn't be any PFAS. Intentionally added PFAS into any outdoor recreation equipment, and New York passed a law saying there couldn't be any intentionally added PFAS into any apparel in general. And so when you have two economies of that size, every brand just has to apply that to a national level, right? Nobody's making the stuff without PFAS for California, New York, and you know, making stuff with PFAS for other areas of the country. So I do think and that's a positive way to also, when we talk about some of the areas for lobbying and those sorts of things, areas that we can refocus on a policy standpoint. When it does come to addressing where we may not be able to get things done at a national level, if we can do it at enough on a state level, it's just going to become too complicated to not do it nationwide. And so I think, some of the policies that we've been excited about on that standpoint is, here in Vermont was the first state to pass the Climate Superfund legislation, which is holding fossil fuel companies accountable for the damages caused from climate change and the cost to clean it up, and also the cost to build climate resilient infrastructure. We saw New York join on at the end of the year last year. We were a great group called New York Businesses for Climate Justice that was active in lobbying for that. We're seeing those same measures now being pushed in California as well too. And so those are areas where it's like we can really start to see change being affected at a national level when you start to see these really, Vermont, not the biggest economy, but again, California, New York, and in some of these other states that start to see this come into play. So I think we're going to start to see a lot more of that when it does come to policy work. And I do think back to the sustainability initiatives, that is another area where brands can lean into and advocate on, right? So it's not activism, it's not you know just sitting there quiet or green hushing, for the theme of this. But it's really in that middle lane of advocacy is an area where brands can also lean into and really push to affect change, because a lot of times, it's for better or for worse, it does take that regulation to really get folks to shift as an industry. And it's there's a lot more impetus to um, do the right thing when you're required to, as opposed to, you just are doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, I wish more brands would do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. But if we could take one thing away from the PFAS regulation, it's that sometimes you have to force their hand. And I do think, like, with the current administration, like, seeing more regulations at a state level will likely be more popular just
Mhm.
because there's things are really bogged down. It's not very efficient. Like, there's a lot of issues going on there. And a lot of the things that you have been talking about are kind of like, if one brand is doing it by themselves, it makes it a lot harder to really like make a change or like really implement it. You don't want to be like an island. And so you've mentioned some collective opportunities for
Mhm.
brands or even industry-wide initiatives or partnerships, things like that. Are there specific ones that you would recommend if, say, someone works with a brand that's listening, or even as a small business owner, and they're kind of like, especially in the current climate, they're kind of struggling to really like prioritize things. They don't want sustainability to fall off for their messaging or their ethos. How can they kind of find support?
Right. So one thing I would say, especially if it's for outdoor brands, and I would say this even if I didn't sit on the board, is OIA in the Outdoor Industry Association is doing just a lot of really great work when it comes to helping brands tackle their sustainability problems, whether that's policy trackers, whether that is, task force, um, building different collabs that then really any brand, regardless of size, can become a part of. I know it's, there's a history there. There's been a lot of shifting and changing in OIA. I think the new direction that the organization is going is a really positive one. The woman Julie Brown there, who is leading the sustainability team, I think has just done a fantastic job. And I think, some great examples of that are, I mentioned the PFAS one where, that was, you had brands like Patagonia, Burton, Neurona, Arc'teryx, all working together. I mean, albeit through Gore, but then like coming together to look to tackle this problem. There was another great initiative when it came to looking at um, recycled stainless steel for reusable drinkware. And that was one where I think it was like Stanley, Hydro Flask, and I forget who else, but all came together and tackled that problem to really find out how to source that and source it in a responsible way, and then made that accessible to really any brand that wanted to do that. Same thing, again, I mentioned renewable energy, sourcing that in Vietnam for factories there, and that was led. Um, I know it was Burton, and I forget who the other two ones were. So I really just like to use those examples, as this is something that OA as an organization is continuing to do, is continuing to lean on, is continuing to not just react, but also be forward looking as well too, and really staying on top of what's coming up, and then being able to help those member brands tackle that. And that's something that, uh, it's really across the board through all aspects of business in the outdoor industry, but really a lot of these task force, whether it's the Climate Action Corps, is the group within sustainability to really look at how to come together to talk about and tackle climate issues, to the Clean Chemistry Management Coalition. There's really just a lot of resources. And that's one thing that I just love about the outdoor industry, is I can't think of anywhere else where competitor brands come together, sit in the same room and say, like, I'm going to share what I know and you're going to share what you know, and we're going to sit together and we're going to figure this out. And then once we get that problem solved, we'll go out into the marketplace and duke it out. And that's where we can market and, do whatever we do as competitors. But to tackle this problem, we're going to come together to do it. And so that's, one of the things that when I say that the outdoor industry is really been at the forefront of that, I think that's just a great example of how it is. There's also, outdoor adjacent people for bikes is also an organization that we're members of as well too. They've been doing similar activities with their sustainability working group, which I also sit on. And so, looking at areas where it's like that came to like tire and tube recycling, it came to other areas to decarbonize, um, you know, at industrial scale of production. So there's a lot of these trade organizations that are really looking to work together to tackle that. But the ones that I'm most privy to are in the outdoor space.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, this has come up a lot in this conversation about like navigating the economic climate, political climate, and that large brands are more likely to survive the next 4 years and like
Hmm.
what is exactly happening. And so for like small to medium sized brands, what would you say? Like, would you have any advice for them in this moment for them not to lose sight of environmental commitments, even though it's like, it's hard for me to phrase this question because it is so like, it's hard to know what actually is going to happen. You know what I mean? It's
Yeah,
kind of like a guessing game at this point, but there are actual real life implications. I've seen some brands closing down, not in the outdoor industry yet, but some people
hmm
that I've talked to have already decided to close. Other ones have closed their manufacturing in the United States, even though they did manufacture in the United States. So there's so much chaos happening.
yeah. It's tough. I'll just be frank. It's really, really tough to say, and it's scary as especially as a small business owner. I think this was even one thing that we made sure to get across when we were on the Hill, and a lot of the reps didn't know that as well too. I think what a lot of people don't realize is that as a small business owner, um, any financial tools that you have to keep your business going. So you're talking about lines of credit, you're talking about loans. It's not like you're a large company and if that falls through, you can declare bankruptcy and as a CEO you leave or whatever. Small businesses are on the hook for this on an individual and a personal level. We have to put personal guarantees um, on those lines of credit, on those loans. And so it really makes people that much more risk adverse to deciding like, hey, is this really worth it? Like, is this worth going so into debt to try to get through the next 3 to 6 months? And I'm not even sure if it's going to be successful. And then I may lose my home as a result of that, right? That's an extreme situation, but these are definitely like real world scenarios that we're all, having to deal with. Even on an agency side, as brands suffer, they pull back budgets, they pull back marketing budgets. So, we see the impacts of that. And so it's really, I'll be honest, it's really hard to stay focused on all the good work that you want to do when you're just trying to tread water and stay afloat. Um, I wish I had a better answer than that. I mean, I think there's obviously still things that you can do. I think um, the one big one is just to not like abandon the work that you're already doing. Is a measure of like short term cost cutting. Um, I think I can't imagine. I can't speak for everybody. I can't say that there's anything that would be so advantageous to that. And then again, that certainly doesn't fall into your sustainability story if that comes out that like we only do it when times are good. um it's just a tricky question. It's hard to
Yeah.
say because I don't think you can't overstate and overlook the reality of it. Like if you're not in business, you're not going to be able to do anything anyway, right? And I say first and foremost, except with the exception of a few handful of individuals that are doing better than the rest of us, you can just do way more as a business than you can as an individual. And so I think there is a lot of value in um, in being able to sustain that business and make sure that you're around getting through this storm at the moment. So I think I guess the one thing that I would say is even in turbulent times like this, not taking your eye off of what your guiding principles, what your values are, making sure, even if maybe you can't commit as much to them right now, not losing sight of what those are. And I think there are um, other areas where you can still lean into and affect impact and affect change that um, require time more than money, right? And so I think, sorry, this is like a little contrary to everything I just said that I'm not sure, and now it's sort of like making itself known. Um, but I think that goes back to on the advocacy side and corporate advocacy side. And so where there are areas to maybe lean into that a little bit more, especially as a small business, especially on a local level, when you talk to your local representatives and you say, I'm a business in your district and I'm struggling and this is really impacting me. Um, they hear that. I think at that same time, you can also, when we go and we say, I'm a business and I'm in your district and I'm really concerned about the effects of climate change. I'm as concerned about it on the effects of our business. I'm concerned about it on the effects of our population. And so I really want to see you do, X, whatever it is to sign on to. So I think that's a way that you can still, be active as a business. And again, you do on a policy side as well, too. Look, people listen more when you're coming as a business than you are as an individual. And so I think there is still a lot of room to lean into that area of things, even if maybe you can't spend as much on maybe some of the other sustainability initiatives. Um, but there's always a creative path to be able to continue to punch up and activate change. And then, once we get through this storm, just continue to build on that once there's sort of sunnier days ahead.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you're a creative guy, so that's easy for you to say. But but no, I think that's a good point. I think you brought up a lot of good points and I feel that the number one way to kind of like move through this era of time in this country is through community.
Mhm.
Whether you are a business and you're finding community with other people that are facing the same challenges, or you're creating a coalition through the outdoor industry to push for like more effective policy that's more beneficial. And I like that you brought up the advocacy piece because I do feel, regardless of the level of politics, that oftentimes like framing things around economics and economic value, just it has more power. Because like if you just say like, oh, well, I think we should protect the environment, it doesn't hold really a lot of weight, even though everyone should feel that way. It's
Right.
like we're impacting the economy, and that is really what the politicians care about at this current moment in time. Okay, so I know that that conversation was maybe not the most uplifting, but I feel it was realistic. And I think it's important to kind of like take things as they are, right? And maybe find ways that we can better connect with each other businesses, and the people around us. So, with that, where can listeners learn more about your work and hopefully get involved with things like the Outdoor Industry Association?
Sure. I would just add on to one thing. While that may not have been the most uplifting, I think there's are still strategies there. Um, and I lean back to we have a personal friend, and she's just been a great friend of the company. We sort of have this network of sustainability and climate related folks. As a wonderful woman named Molly Kawahata, who she is a former climate advisor to the Obama White House, and she really looks into the science of hope. And one of the things that she speaks about is the GAP framework. And the GAP framework is hope isn't just about wishful thinking, but that it's something that's actually actionable. And so the GAP framework is goals, actions, and I'm sorry, goals, agency, and I forget what the P is now that I said this, but it's basically the same as strategy, right? So if you're saying this is the goal that I have, this is a strategy that I have to get there, and I have the agency to do it, your outcomes of establishing that goal and really creating that hope that you want to see um, are much, much higher. And then that just leads to so many other more positive outcomes, whether it's business, whether it's in personal relationships, whether it's in just like quality of life. So I do kind of want to close with that even in dark times, I think, I'm sorry, the P stands for pathways, goals, agencies, and pathways. Even in these times, I think we can still find those areas to be hopeful because these are things that we can still affect change on, regardless of what's going on. And so I think it's so much of that is, finding that strategy to get there and then really having the agency to move forward with it in. And so again, I think that's where advocacy plays a role. So yeah, so it's not all doom and gloom, and there are things that we can all still do. As far as us, Our website is a little out of date. I jokingly say that it's not the cobbler's child has no shoes, but the cobbler's child's shoes have holes in the soles and the laces are ripped and knotted together and the seams are coming undone. But our website is composedcreative.com. We're also on LinkedIn. Our Instagram is somewhat active, but not as much. So LinkedIn is probably the best place. And it's just composed. You'll see the D is in the brackets as part of our branding. So that's how you'll know it's us. I would say we're also, some other things that we do that you may be able to find out about, but that I would encourage folks to do. We're Brand Alliance members with Protect Our Winners. I think POW is doing a lot of great work. And when folks are looking for what can I do about climate in these times, I think POW is a great organization to look at. I think, I think one of the things that you hit on that's really important is about community. And I think community is, it's always been important. I think it's just becoming so much more important in these times. And you're spot on, whether it's your business community, if it's just your personal community. And so those are areas that I think, you can find comfort, support, friendship and all these other great things in. At the same time, you also find ways to activate, right? So areas that you can find the agency collectively to go and tackle those goals. I know POW is really doing a lot more when it does come to community building, as well as a lot of the work that they're doing with advocacy, both with their various alliances, but as well as with the business community as well too. And so I think that's a way that we've felt really good about being a part of engaging, learning, and continuing to be able to feel like we can punch above our weight as being part of that community and take collective action.
Thanks for listening. And if you like what you hear, let me know. Leave a review and be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can find us on Instagram at outdoor.minimalist.book, on YouTube, or subscribe to our weekly newsletter at theoutdoorminimalist.com. For even more updates, other educational resources, and to help build an outdoor community with the shared goal to create a better outdoor space as we recreate.